Can a person question his own faith? Can a Christian question the divinity of Jesus? Can a Muslim question the historical accuracy of an event that has traditionally been associated with Islam? Can a Jew question an interpretation that has been accepted for generations? And if we go even further, could an ancient Greek or Roman believer have questioned whether the gods could literally be seen from the top of Mount Olympus? These questions may sound simple, but they lead us to a much deeper problem. What happens when reason comes into conflict with faith? If an idea can be comprehended by the human mind, then surely it can also be questioned by the human mind. On this channel, we have already discussed examples of people challenging ideas found in religious scriptures or traditions, ideas that at least on the surface may not appear to make sense. But there is something interesting that happens whenever a religious idea is questioned. Every religion contains people who interpret the same verse, the same story, or the same tradition differently. One interpretation may be accepted by one group while another interpretation is rejected by another. And sometimes the argument becomes very simple. How can you possibly reject something that millions of people before you believed? This is where the question of authority becomes important. Does the majority determine what is true? Or can an individual arrive at an interpretation that challenges what the majority believes? Because throughout religious history, new interpretations have often been treated as dangerous. Sometimes they are called heretical, sometimes they are described as deviations, and sometimes merely asking the question is seen as a problem. This raises a much bigger philosophical question. Is religion asking us to suspend reason in favor of faith? There are religious traditions in which faith is presented as submission to God, even when human beings cannot understand everything that God commands. And religious stories sometimes seem to illustrate precisely this idea. One of the most interesting examples is Abraham. There is a story about Abraham being thrown into a fire by Nimrod, but it is important to clarify something here. This is not an episode found in the book of Genesis itself. The story appears in later Jewish, Islamic, and interpretive traditions in different forms. One Jewish tradition connects Abraham with a confrontation involving fire and Nimrod. Another early Jewish text, the Book of Jubilees, contains a different story involving Abraham's brother Haran and fire. Later rabbinic traditions develop the story further. In one famous version, Abraham is brought before Nimrod and refuses to worship fire. Abraham reasons with him, if fire should be worshipped because it has power, then perhaps water should be worshipped because it can extinguish fire. And if water should be worshipped, then perhaps clouds should be worshipped because they carry water. Then perhaps the wind, and eventually perhaps human beings themselves. Abraham's argument is essentially a philosophical challenge to the idea that power alone makes something worthy of worship. Nimrod, according to tradition, responds by throwing Abraham into a furnace, and Abraham survives. But then comes the fascinating part. His brother Haran is watching all what is happening. Haran supposedly thinks that if Abraham survives, he will declare himself to be on Abraham's side. But if Abraham dies, he will side with Nimrod. Abraham emerges from the fire unharmed. Haran then declares himself a follower of Abraham. He too is thrown into the fire, but unlike Abraham, Haran dies. This creates a striking contrast. Abraham enters the fire, and the fire does not harm him. Haran enters the fire and he is killed. But what exactly are we supposed to learn from this? Is the lesson simply that Abraham had faith and God saved him? Or is there something deeper going on? Because the story creates an uncomfortable question. If faith means complete submission to God, does that mean we should stop asking questions? Was Abraham chosen because he simply believed? Or was Abraham chosen precisely because he questioned? This is what makes Abraham such an interesting figure. Abraham is not presented merely as someone who accepts everything without thought. He questions, he reasons, he challenges assumptions about the divine. And yet the story of the furnace is often interpreted as a story about complete submission. So perhaps there is a contradiction here. Perhaps the story is not telling us that reason is useless. Perhaps it is telling us something more complicated about the relationship between reason and faith. And this is where I think we should be careful. A believer today is not going to be told to reproduce Abraham's experience literally. If someone today stands before a fire and says, I have faith in God, so I will enter it because Abraham survived, no serious religious authority would normally tell that person that this is what faith requires. They would simply say Abraham was a prophet. You are not Abraham. But then another question appears. Why tell this story at all? Is it simply an inspirational story? Or is it intended to demonstrate God's power? Is it meant to show the superiority of faith? Or could the fire itself have a metaphorical meaning? Could the story be communicating something about Abraham's courage, his rejection of false gods, his willingness to stand against political authority, or his relationship with the divine? If that is possible, then why should a believer be forbidden from asking the question? Why can't we ask whether a religious story should be understood literally, historically, symbolically, or metaphorically? And perhaps this is where the story of Abraham and Haran becomes especially interesting. If Haran represents the person who wants and waits to see which side wins before declaring his allegiance, while Abraham represents the person who commits himself regardless of the consequences, then perhaps the story is not primarily about fire at all. Perhaps it is about conviction. Perhaps it is about the difference between believing because something is true and believing because everyone else believes it. And this brings us back to the original question that I was asking before. Can a person question the foundations of his own faith? I think the answer has to be yes. A Christian should be able to ask what is the historical and philosophical basis for the divinity of Jesus. A Muslim should be able to ask, how do we establish that a particular historical event actually happened? A Jew should be able to ask, why should this interpretation of the scripture be preferred over another? And a believer of any tradition should be able to ask, what exactly do I believe? And why do I believe it? Because if faith cannot survive a question, then perhaps the problem is not the question. Perhaps the problem is the way we understand faith. The danger is that once we say the majority has always believed this, we stop searching for truth and start counting followers. But truth is not necessarily determined by numbers. There was a time when people believed the earth was the center of the universe. There was a time when particular interpretations of scripture were almost universally accepted within certain communities. And there was always someone who asked, but what if we are wrong? That person may be called a heretic or a philosopher or a reformer or simply a person who is asking a question. And perhaps this is the most important thing we can learn from Abraham. Maybe Abraham's greatest quality was not that he stopped thinking and simply submitted. Maybe it was that he was willing to question what he saw around him until he found something he considered worthy of submission. So perhaps the real question, I guess, is not, should I question my faith? Perhaps the real question is, can my faith survive my questions? And if it cannot, then what exactly are we defending? A truth or simply a tradition? Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Please subscribe and follow if you like the video, and bye.